I don't even remember what I was wearing that day. Just that the porch light was still on, a defiant beacon against the encroaching dawn, and the house was empty. Eerily, painfully empty. My name is Kelsey Monroe. And 6 months ago, I gave everything I had, literally, to save the home I grew up in. The house that held the ghost of scraped knees on faded carpets, echoed whispered teenage dreams behind closed doors, and cradled every memory that kept me going after long, brutal shifts in the emergency room. It was more than just wood and plaster, it was the last tangible anchor to a childhood that often felt adrift. I paid off my parents' $280,000 debt. And the very next morning, they were gone. No goodbye. No thank you. Just a single, neatly folded envelope on the cold hardwood floor of the entryway, placed with a perverse sense of finality. It looked innocent enough, a cream-colored square tucked beneath the decorative key bowl that had always held spare house keys, keys that now meant nothing to them. I picked it up, my fingers numb. The paper felt heavy, denser than it looked, as if each word it contained carried the weight of years of unspoken disappointments. My name, written in my mother's elegant, looping script, was surprisingly steady. I tore it open, my breath catching in my throat even before I read the damning lines. Thanks for fixing our credit, loser. We moved to Florida with your brother. Don't call. I didn't cry. The tears were trapped somewhere deep inside, frozen solid. I didn't even scream. There was no sound at all from me, just the hollow echo of the empty house. I just sat there, collapsing onto the cold hardwood floor, holding that note like it was a knife plunged straight into my chest. Because in a way, it was. A cold, sharp blade carving out the last vestiges of hope and loyalty I harbored for them. They thought they'd scammed their daughter. What they didn't know was this: I had the deed. You see, when I paid off their debt, when I signed over every last cent I had, when I emptied my savings and strapped myself with a new, daunting loan, I didn't just hand them the checks. I made sure the house was legally transferred to my name. Every signature, every notarized document, every official stamp, all tucked away in a neat manila folder. A folder they never bothered to read. A folder they likely tossed aside in their haste, too blinded by the perceived windfall to care about the fine print. They thought they'd pulled off the ultimate con. They thought they had left me with nothing but a worthless debt and a mocking goodbye. What they really did was hand me the key to my own freedom. The story of that letter, that empty house, didn't begin that morning. It started 6 months earlier, in a much colder place than Florida. I was sleeping in my car after back-to-back shifts at the hospital. My ex had kicked me out of our shared apartment, another casualty of a life that felt like it was constantly demanding more than I had to give. I didn't want to burden anyone, especially not my parents, who always seemed to have their hands full with my brother. Then came the call. It was late, past midnight, the kind of hour when good news rarely arrives. My mom's voice, usually so clipped and dramatic, was a trembling sob on the other end. "Kelsey," she wailed, "your father, he's going to lose the house. We're going to lose everything. Your dad made some very bad investments again." Again. That word hung in the air, a familiar refrain in the symphony of our family's financial woes. Of course he did. My father, with his grand schemes and even grander failures, was a consistent architect of disaster. His investments were usually get-rich-quick schemes that always, without fail, left a trail of debt and disappointment. My heart sank, not for their reckless choices, but for the house. The house was different. It was the only constant, the only place where I felt a true sense of belonging. Even as a child, when my brother, Liam, consumed their attention, the house was my silent confidant. I remember asking about the substantial inheritance they'd received from Grandpa just a few years prior, a sizable sum that could have, should have, secured their future. "Oh, honey," she sniffled, a sound I knew all too well, a prelude to deflection. "We gave it to your brother to help with his business. You know how important his dreams are." My brother. Liam. The golden boy. The one who crashed every car, burned through every job, and still received all their love and endless resources like it was his birthright. Liam, who never seemed to face real consequences, always bailed out, always given another chance. While I, the dutiful daughter, the nurse, the independent one, was consistently told to fend for myself. But the house, it wasn't just walls and wood. It was my sanctuary. It was where I'd nursed my own scraped knees, whispered my secret teenage dreams into the darkness, and found solace in the quiet hum of the old refrigerator after a particularly tough day at the hospital. It was my roots, my history, the one thing that connected me to a past that, for all its flaws, was mine. It was my last piece of belonging in a world where I often felt like a temporary resident. So I did what I always did. I saved them. The decision was made in a blur of exhaustion and desperate loyalty. I knew it would cripple me financially, but the thought of losing that house, of it falling into strangers' hands, was unbearable. I maxed out every credit card, drained every single account I had carefully built over years of grueling shifts, even took out a personal loan against my small but growing investments. Every penny, every last shred of my financial security, was funneled towards their rescue. When I walked into their living room with those cashier's checks, totaling a staggering $280,000, my parents cried. Not quietly, but with dramatic sobs that felt as performative as they were heartfelt. My mother collapsed into a chair, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. My father, usually so stoic and distant, did something he hadn't done since I was 12 years old, since I'd won that science fair and made him momentarily proud. He pulled me into a tight hug. "You're our hero, Kelsey," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. And for a fleeting moment, a dangerous, fragile moment, I believed him. I believed that perhaps, finally, after all these years, my sacrifices had cemented my place, that I was truly loved, seen, appreciated. I allowed myself to bask in the warmth of that single, rare embrace, letting it lull me into a false sense of security. It was the most expensive hug I'd ever received. That feeling of warmth, of being their hero, evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. The months that followed were a deceptive calm. I was recovering financially, slowly piecing my life back together after emptying my coffers. They were pleasant, even outwardly grateful. There were no more urgent phone calls about debt, no more requests for money. They seemed content, talking vaguely about starting fresh and making smarter choices. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, I was quietly executing my own plan. A contingency. A safeguard. My lawyer, a brilliant woman I had found through a colleague, had advised me. "Kelsey," she'd said, "when you're bailing out family like this, especially after a history of similar issues, you need to protect yourself. Make sure this house truly becomes yours." So, as I transferred the funds, she simultaneously drafted the legal documents. The deed to the house. Every signature, every notary stamp, every meticulously crafted clause ensuring the property was legally transferred into my name, not just paid off for them. They signed, barely glancing at the papers, too eager to clear their names and debts, too trusting that their loser daughter would simply do as she was told. The manila folder containing the signed, notarized deed was tucked away in my fireproof safe, a quiet secret. And then came that day. The day the porch light was still on, mocking the empty house. I don't remember the specifics of the shift I'd just finished, only that it had been particularly grueling, draining me of every ounce of energy. All I wanted was my own bed, my own quiet space. As I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The front door was slightly ajar. A cold gust of wind seemed to sweep past me as I pushed it open. The house was silent. Too silent. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, all gone. A knot formed in my stomach. "Mom? Dad?" My voice echoed eerily through the empty rooms. Then I saw it. The curtains ripped out of the living room windows, lying in a tangled heap on the floor. The flower beds outside, usually meticulously tended by my mother, were dug up, barren patches of dirt. And on the hardwood floor, by the key bowl, was that cream-colored envelope. The letter. The "thanks for fixing our credit, loser" letter. The one that severed the last thread of connection. They took everything they could, furniture, sentimental items, anything of value, and ran. They weren't just gone, they had vanished, leaving behind only emptiness and a searing message of contempt. But not really. Because in 24 hours, they'd learn a very painful lesson. A lesson in consequences. The sale they tried to pull off? Invalid. Fraudulent, actually. The house wasn't theirs to sell. It was legally mine. The next morning, I walked into the title office, my step steady, my heart surprisingly calm. The initial shock had given way to a cold, clear resolve. I handed over my manila folder, the one they never bothered to read. The clerk, a kind older woman named Martha, looked at me, then at the documents, then back at me with a puzzled frown. "Miss Monroe," she began, "there seems to be a discrepancy. Your parents attempted to sell this property yesterday, but the deed was officially transferred to your name 6 months ago. Their sale is invalid. In fact, it's fraudulent." I watched as her words confirmed what I already knew. Their dream life in Florida, built on deceit and my sacrifice, started crumbling before it even began. By that evening, the sale was frozen. Their moving trucks, likely halfway to the Sunshine State, would soon be turned around. And I posted one simple thing on Facebook. Not a long rant. Not an emotional outburst. Just this. If you ever feel used, don't get angry. Get smart. Always read the deed. I didn't tag them. I didn't have to. The family grapevine, always buzzing with gossip, would ensure they saw it. Then came the fallout. My phone, which had been blissfully silent for months, began to explode. Voicemails stacked up, each one more furious than the last. Texts flew in, rapid fire, from numbers I hadn't heard from in years. My brother, Liam, usually so detached, screamed profanities in a voice message, accusing me of ruining his life. My mother's voice, once sugar-sweet, was now laced with desperate begging, laced with crocodile tears. My father, his stoic facade completely shattered, was simply furious. "You ruined everything," he bellowed in one message, his voice cracking with rage. "You think this is funny?" my mother shrieked in another, as if I had orchestrated a cruel joke. "You have to fix this, Kelsey. We're stranded." Liam's text demanded, as if I was the one responsible for their choices. Funny? Funny is them calling me their hero one night and calling me a loser the next. Funny is watching their carefully constructed house of cards, built on my generosity, collapse with such poetic justice. So, I sent one group text. A single, concise message to the family chat they had foolishly kept me in. Per Florida law, attempting to sell a home you don't legally own is considered fraud. I have changed the locks. The property is mine. Silence. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched for days, broken only by the chirping of crickets outside my now empty, yet full, house. Then, the guilt trip started again, predictably. "We just wanted to start over, Kelsey. A new beginning for the family. We didn't think you'd go this far, honey. We're family. You're really going to leave your own parents homeless?" No. They were a weight I carried because I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought it meant endless giving, even when there was nothing left of me. I thought it meant being their emotional and financial safety net, absorbing every blow, every failure. Now I knew better. The weeks that followed were quiet. Gloriously, beautifully quiet. The empty spaces in the house, once filled with ghosts of the past, now felt expansive, full of potential. I changed all the locks, replacing the old, worn mechanisms with sturdy, new ones. Each click of the bolt was a small victory, a declaration of ownership, a promise of security. I repainted the walls, covering the faded, institutional beige with soft, calming blues and greens. It was a small act of rebellion, a way to imprint my own identity onto the space that had always felt like theirs. I turned Dad's old office, the one I was never allowed into, the sanctuary where he plotted his disastrous investments, into a bright, airy studio for my small side business, designing custom medical equipment organizers. It was a space for my creativity, my ambition, my growth. I sat in the sunroom, a place I rarely frequented before, and read novels I used to skip because I was too busy working extra shifts to cover their bills. I replanted the orchids Mom had always said were too delicate to survive in our climate, meticulously tending to their fragile beauty. They bloomed vibrantly, resiliently, and slowly, so did I. The weight I had unknowingly carried for decades began to lift. The invisible chains of obligation loosened. I found myself humming as I cooked, laughing freely at silly memes, making plans with friends without the constant undercurrent of anxiety about the next family crisis. My sleep improved. My shoulders, perpetually tense, finally relaxed. One day, I decided it was time for a final, symbolic act. I boxed up all the junk they had left behind, a few old family photos, mostly of Liam, some tax documents, unfiled, naturally, my father's golf trophies from years ago. Things they hadn't bothered to take. I drove it to Uncle Brian's house, a distant relative Liam had somehow convinced to let them crash there while they figured things out. I set the box gently on the porch, a silent offering. Just as I turned to leave, the door creaked open. Dad stood there, looking older, smaller, his face etched with a mixture of resentment and something that looked almost like shame. His voice, usually so booming, cracked. "You could have just said thank you, Kelsey, for letting us stay here." I looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in a long time. There was no anger left in me, no desire to wound him further. Just a profound, quiet clarity. "No," I said, my voice calm, steady, clear as a bell. "You could have just treated me like a daughter. Not a credit card." And then I left. No drama. No final speech. Just the soft click of the car door, the hum of the engine, and the rhythmic sound of my heels on the concrete as I walked away. My heart, once a hostage to their expectations, now beat freely within my chest. I've blocked every number from them. Deleted the family group chat. Erased the digital breadcrumbs that led back to a life that wasn't truly mine. And for the first time in years, my life is unequivocally, gloriously mine. I laugh in the kitchen without hearing slammed doors or whispered arguments. I invite friends over who say thank you and genuinely mean it, without ulterior motives. I plant bright, vibrant flowers in the beds where bitterness and neglect once grew. They taught me that love was conditional. That it was a transaction. But I learned something far more powerful from their betrayal. That I am not what I give others. I am what I choose to keep for myself. And this house? This life I've built, brick by painful brick, out of the ashes of their deceit. It's not a monument to betrayal. It's proof that sometimes, walking away isn't the end. It's the most liberating, powerful beginning.